they're a critical reflection of who we are as a society, but they also offer possibilities.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Barbara Bell, Artistic Director of the Kingston WritersFest, and you might recognize that name too because she was a previous guest on this show when we talked about the book Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. It was a fascinating conversation about a very interesting and unorthodox book. Now, Barbara is responsible for programming the Kingston WritersFest, and as you might imagine, this year in 2020, it's not happening as per usual, but it is happening. The festival will be entirely digital this year in September of 2020. If you want to learn more about that, go to whatonearthisgoingon.ca, follow the links, and learn more about the Kingston WritersFest. Now, in this conversation, we talk about a wide variety of things. We start the conversation talking about the impeachment of Donald Trump, as this was recorded in December of 2019. We move quickly to climate change, how we consume the news, and how polarization isn't new, although it is accelerated today. And then we start talking about the Writers' Festival itself. How do you decide what authors and what books to program in the festival? What does it mean when something is beautiful writing, and what does it mean when writing has impact? What is the job of the artist and of the author? What is the job, of course, of the reader and of the audience member? What happens when something goes wrong in a show, and why can that sometimes be a good thing? We end up talking about how Barbara got involved with the festival and some of her favorite books as well as some of mine to round out the conversation. Now, if you like this episode or any other, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. It helps immensely to spread the word about this podcast. You can do the same thing on social media, and you can go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to learn more about this podcast, to get in touch with me by social media or by email, and to let me know what guests and what subjects you think we should be discussing in the future. Finally, at the website, you can get the show notes for this episode. So those are all the things that we referenced. You can get links to videos and different things that you can read to get deeper into this conversation. And as always, let me know what on earth you think is going on. All right, Barbara Bell, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
I've been wanting to talk to you on this program for a long time.
Yeah, it took a little while to pin me down.
I finally roped you into it.
I'm so elusive. Hard to get.
Why did you finally overcome your fear of talking to me?
Yeah, fear of talk. I'm so afraid of you.
Yeah. That's obviously what it is.
It's interesting how it started, and it was just like we were working on programming Kingston WritersFest in February this year, 2019.
Of which you are the artistic director.
Yes, I'm the artistic director of Kingston WritersFest. And you were sitting on our programming committee, and you said something about doing a podcast, and my ears pricked up. Because I'm quite a ham, actually. And so then you were explaining what it was, what on earth is going on. I looked at some of your podcasts, and then you said, hey, would you ever? And I'm like, yes, I would. But then it was a matter of finding time. And, of course, we have this big ramp up to our September festival. And that's how she goes.
And here we are in cold December here in Kingston.
Yeah.
Perfect timing other than to dig into a podcast.
Yeah, this is a great thing to be doing on a snowy afternoon.
So I do want to talk about Kingston Writers Fest, how you got involved, where the festival comes from, where it's headed in the future, and what it's kind of given you in terms of your perspective, being at the center of this incredible event that occurs every September. But before we do, I wanted to ask you the big question, and you can take that anywhere you like, Barbara. It's a broad question to get a broad set of details, and I ask it with a certain tone. If I were to go up to you in the street, hey, what on earth is going on? It might be about your personal life and where things are going in the last few weeks for you or whatever, the weather. But I ask it with the tone of like almost exasperation. What on earth is going on here? And a lot of people take that to mean Donald Trump, populism, climate change, even nuclear weapons, or whatever they seem to be preoccupied with at that time. And so you can take this anywhere you like. Don't feel like you have to go in a certain direction. But Barbara, what on earth is going on?
Such a good question. What on earth is going on? I have never been much of a news hound, but I have to confess I am watching the procedure to bring Donald Trump to impeachment. It's like a train wreck. And I can't take my eyes away because there's so much at stake.
Yeah.
I mean, quite apart from his quite obnoxious personality and the lack of anything redeeming about him and, his lack of ability to actually lead a country. It's quite shocking. But because so much is tied up in governments in the West being functional and attending to the things that need to be attended to in the most urgent way possible, how can this be taking all of our attention, sucking all the air out of the room when we have only a few years to address climate change? And of course, the U.S. is going backwards in leaps and bounds in terms of climate protections and that kind of thing. Same in Canada. There's a real struggle going on. And we watch this and this is where you start to think, how can I, as a single individual person, have any effect whatsoever for the better?
Well, especially when we talk, we're bringing Trump into the conversation right away, and he does suck the oxygen almost out of everyone. But we do have to address it. And sometimes I think, well, by paying attention to this, we're giving him what he wants. That's all it is in my mind. And I'm simplifying, I know, and generalizing, but Donald Trump seems to just want the attention. And I don't mean this in a childish sense. For him, it doesn't matter what the story is as long as he's at the front of it, as long as he's being talked about and he's the center of the storm.
Yeah. It's all about showbiz for him.
Right, and that's been a theme of his presidency long before the impeachment. It was a theme of his campaign. It was kind of a theme of his life as the head of The Apprentice, as the guy that sat behind the table all those years ago. That just to be at the center of the storm and the center of the story. And we're giving him what he wants, but what choice do we have? Do we ignore it, pretend it's not happening, and allow this to go ahead?
I think that's exactly the argument that's taking place in Congress right now, is that as lawmakers, they have a bounden duty to pay attention to this, because if they don't, they're negligent. They're part of the problem. And so they are one by one standing up and saying, we cannot not to pay attention to this.
Right, but it's so on party lines. Like that country, like our country, is so polarized that we know exactly how Republicans are going to vote and Democrats, except for a few who maybe be in a swing district. But there's nobody who seems to be voting. Well, maybe they are voting with their conscience. I don't know, but it's just so predictable.
They say they're voting with their conscience.
Right.
I have to confess, I was actually watching a little bit of this sort of last debate as people are casting their votes, and the tone from Republicans who are going to support Trump and not vote for the articles of impeachment are saying they're voting their conscience. I truly don't believe he's done anything wrong. There's no proof, etc.
Right.
So it's a kind of a brainwash scenario.
Well, and a signal of our age, that you just kind of pick your side, pick your facts, go with it, and you can truly believe in that. I don't think that people on either side of this there may be cognitive dissonance, as there is with climate change that you mentioned.
Yeah, indeed, right? We don't want to have to think about it.
Right, but I do believe that these guys think that they're doing the right thing, whether they're doing the right thing for themselves, for their re-election, for their party, for their country, whatever it is. Yeah. I don't think anyone is out there with evil intent.
No.
But that's the problem, is because there seems to be such a divide that we can't point out where is the good and where is the bad.
Well, this is where the whole sort of infiltration of all of our ways of consuming news.
Right.
We're being controlled like little puppets. That's another thing that you start to think, I'm going to have to completely, withdraw from sources of news, because I don't know what to believe. I'm being, the algorithms are feeding me the things I already believe. I never get another viewpoint. And again, there's just this feeling of powerlessness in a sense.
Yeah, there's a 19th century philosopher who said that you should withhold your judgment and your decision and your belief of anything until you have sufficient evidence. It was Clifford, the philosopher, who said this, which is interesting because we seem to jump to a conclusion and a belief pretty quickly in our world today because there are so many beliefs to be had. Mm-hmm. We're overwhelmed. I mean, this is one theme of the modern age. One answer to the question, what on earth is going on, is there's so much. And if I spend any time thinking about one belief that I have, the other 999 million beliefs that I should have to be put to the side, which is partly coming into play here, although this one conversation about Donald Trump is the centerpiece of everything. It sucks the oxygen out. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if, this is perhaps a tie back into books and writing and literature and a Writers Fest here in Kingston, which is that the way in which we're paying attention to this, whether it's through the news and journalism or through just sheer media, social media, the images and the videos that we see, is there an art to this cognitive dissonance or even this deception? Or is it just the machine that we seem to be living in? Is this the result of people making an effort to make you believe something? Or is it almost the accident of an accelerated, connected age?
Yeah, well, so maybe a little bit of both. I mean, I really do think there are forces at work that are trying to control outcomes, mm-hmm. And make us believe certain things. But also, yeah, we operate at such a pace with so much input that it could be partly just accidental. You like to think you have control over what you're going to choose to think about and believe, but maybe you don't for either or both of those reasons.
Right, because there's so many things hitting you from so many different angles. Yeah. It's impossible to keep track of it. Yeah. And, the concomitant with all of this, of course, is social media, the digital age, the internet. Yeah. And this is working in a way that we can't really predict how it will change us. Technology is changing us before we can change it. Yeah. And in a way, social media, the internet are working exactly as we built them to. They're working to engage you. Yes. Engage you as much as possible. And in that engagement, if you start believing things or believing them more strongly, well, great. Hopefully you'll click some more.
But we always sort of believed when social media started, and like, this is great. We have access to everything. There's interconnectedness. But we're assuming a benevolence about that. But because it's been monetized, it's no longer benevolent. Somebody's got... somebody has a purpose.
Right. Who benefits from this is the question we have to ask.
Somebody has a motive.
Right.
And so that's where we become victims and pawns in whatever this game is.
Yeah.
But, I don't think this argument is brand new. I think it was ever thus that when you have strong polarization over any issue, and it could be religion, and you've seen it in schisms, like religious schisms, like, the birth of Protestantism, where you have people who are towing the traditional line, or any line, say line A, saying to the folks who believe line B, how can you believe this stuff you're believing? And then these people who feel enlightened are looking back at line A and saying, how can you not believe this?
Right. And it becomes a moral issue. Mm-hmm. Something, for example, climate change, which really is a scientific question.
Yes.
And I'm not saying it should just be devolved to scientists. I'm saying we need to take political, large-scale social action on this. But the question, is it happening or not, is a purely scientific question. But because it's become such a polarizing issue, it's become a moral question. Mm-hmm. And if you don't believe what I believe, then you are morally bankrupt.
Yes.
And therefore I have the right, maybe, to shut you down, to shut you up. If we continue on this line, and this is going to sound silly, but you brought up the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Millions of people, I think, over history have been killed in religious conflict. And I think because of the 30 Years' War, which that religious struggle led to, I think it was 1/3 the population of some parts of Europe were killed or lost in war and in plague as a result of that conflict. If we draw that line, it's pretty easy to see that people would have thought in that time, you're Catholic? I don't care if you die. In fact, I'll kill you because you're Catholic. Or the reverse is also true.
Well, or the American Civil War. The line was drawn, and it was there were moral standpoints, strong moral standpoints being taken on either side that were extremely polarized. And so it became okay to kill your countrymen.
Right. But they're no longer your countrymen.
And it was devastatingly, I don't know what the losses were. Not good with numbers. I'm good with words, not with numbers. But I think we know that there was a huge casualty
it was
count.
It's fascinating that the Civil War in the United States, I think it was hundreds of thousands from a country that wasn't that big yet.
Not that populous, yeah.
But if you look at statistics, how the United States military was tiny and then all of a sudden blasted out of proportion, was having a war that was bigger than anything Europe had ever seen, and was a presage to the First World War, the Second World War, in a country that hadn't seen that kind of violence. It had a violent past, but there was this feeling that I was right to kill my neighbor because they were no longer my neighbor. They had given up, that they'd separated, or they were trying to be my oppressor, or whatever the logic is.
What a weird lie to tell yourself. That's
Sure.
It's just so artificial, right?
Right.
But in order to be able to stick with what you think is the truth, you have to jump through these mental hoops to make that group of people other, instead of saying we all are citizens of the United States of America. We've got to work this out.
And yet it doesn't seem that far away, because if I think of, I believe that climate change is real and it requires action on the part of the entire global community. Someone who denies that, I'm not going to say it's evil. I'm not going to say it's repugnant, but I'm going to say that it is troubling and needs to be overcome.
Misguided. Yeah, absolutely.
But if that continues, we will potentially perish. Our civilization could potentially collapse as a result of that belief.
Yeah, but I think the problem with trying to reason with someone who is a climate change denier is that the tools that you have in your toolkit to try to explain something like that to someone with those beliefs are not going to be helpful.
In other words,
you actually need to learn different tools
Yeah.
to connect with them.
It's like having a wrong screw head for a wrong screw.
It doesn't matter how many times you try to put your Robertson into
just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what do we do about that?
Yeah, what do we do? Well, maybe we write good books that help open up the conversation.
Do you think that books are still a main way to have these conversations?
They're certainly key. I think that writers are expressing what is most current and top of mind concerns that the general public has. And you'll see that they're almost in advance because they're critical thinkers. And so they're writing from this very deep personal, even, fiction certainly, as well as nonfiction. They're writing from a deep personal conviction or a question. And they're exploring that and interrogating it. And then by doing it well, they're engaging us and inviting us into those questions. And so I think that they're a critical reflection of who we are as a society. But they also offer possibilities.
What is it about the writer, whether it's their life or their skill, their toolbox, that allows them to do this? Like, for example, when I think of what allows a writer to do this is that they're given the time. Take 6 months, go off into a cabin in the woods or whatever it is.
Back up. You have to have the drive. And,
okay.
Yeah, and the persistence. It's not easy. Yeah, that seems like a little, glowing image of, oh, lucky them.
Right.
But that is not easy work. To isolate yourself day in, day out, sit at that blankety blank screen and produce words day in and day out. That is not easy work.
Is that inherent, that drive, or
Yeah.
is that learned over time?
No, I think, and the gift. You have to have the gift
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
To write good literature of any kind. You have to have that very first. Then you have to, I think even people who haven't been given opportunities educationally, if they have the talent and the drive, they'll write because they can't do anything else.
To what extent, when we're talking about writing, whether it's in the context of a writers' festival or just in this conversation, are we talking about craft and something that is developed, on the basis of that drive, on the basis of that passion, developing a craft in order to tell a story, as opposed to, and maybe it's not necessarily opposition, but on the other hand, just having this sense of the world and this poetic need to express it?
Yeah, well, there's the balance. I mean, was it Einstein who said 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
It was him or Woody Allen or something like that. Yeah.
Might have been the wood stir, who knows. But obviously that passion cannot be front and center every day. And if you're writing a 1,000-page book, for instance, how do you keep that passion and that whatever that inspiration, that kernel that you are driven to try to express, how do you keep that going in the midst of the grunt work of good writing? Because it's rewriting. That's what it is. That's good writing. Is
over and over and over again.
And over, yeah.
When you're reading a book, how do you know it's something you want to bring to the festival? From your perspective, I know that you have a committee of people who are gathered to try to determine this, but the final buck often rests with you.
Always rests with me.
So then how do you make this determination?
So, yeah, it's I'm going to know within a few pages if there's literary quality there. And I'm not talking literary in the sense of really highbrow necessarily, but I mean really good craftsmanship, well-constructed sentences and paragraphs, and nothing that leaps out immediately going, oh, awkward, or, oh,
Or cliche.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly. Not fresh thought, not, any number of writerly sins. As soon as they pop up, then I'm less likely to program that book.
What's an example? And I know this is a tricky question to ask you for examples because you've probably read, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of books, not only in your lifetime, but especially in this period at which you've been the arbiter for this festival. What's an example or two of books that had to be programmed if you could get the author, of course?
I can give you a couple of examples from the 2019 festival.
Perfect.
So we received a reading copy of Megan Gale Cole's book, and I opened it, as I often do, and within paragraphs I was like, oh my God, this writing's good. And it's just such a delicious feeling to read something that is just so good. And I walked into the other office where my colleague sits, and I started reading to her. I said, here, take this, read the first chapter. And she came in with her eyes wide, and she said, oh my God. And it was just like, we have to have her.
Yeah, yeah.
Another one was Marina Endicott's The Difference. Oh, that book is so beautifully written. So beautifully written. Can
I ask you, what does that mean? Like, I think I get a sense of what it means as a fellow reader. But if we were to put a fine point on that and say, what does beautiful writing mean? What does it look like on the page? What does it sound like? Can you be more specific? I know that's tough, but... Yeah,
I can try. Definitely, there has to be a voice that rings true. And I'm talking about the writerly voice. It has to be really true to what it's trying to express, and it has to be appropriate to what it's trying to express. And then you want to see that they are evoking all of your senses in a kind of effortless way. So it doesn't feel, labored. It just surrounds you with, I'm there, I'm in that, I'm with that character. And like I said, then there are no moments when you go, that's anachronistic, or that's really awkward. Bits of writing that it has to just really flow seamlessly. And I'm a lover of long books. I'm not saying it has to be poetry that's been honed down. I mean, there's this real skill in that I don't have. And so, I mean, it doesn't matter if there are a lot of words. That doesn't matter to me, but it's the way they're used.
Yeah. What about nonfiction? Is there a difference here when we're talking about, say, a book about current events or a book about the decay of our political order, for example?
I'm a little more forgiving in terms of nonfiction because content is really important. But, and again, I wouldn't program anything for the festival that was really sloppily written.
Sure.
Obviously, nonfiction writers are going to come with different levels of skill come to the table with different levels of skill. But I absolutely do love an elegantly written piece of nonfiction. And there are definitely nonfiction writers, historians, journalists who really have the gift.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that sometimes overcome the fact that the content is not topical, not really addressing, say, the question, what on earth is going on today? If we have a book that doesn't really address that, but addresses something 100 years ago and there's no tie to today, but it's beautifully written, is there a fit for that?
It would have to be a topic that people would find interesting and would be able to take something away from.
Yeah.
I don't program, it doesn't specifically have to be topical, but clearly, as I was saying earlier, writers are capturing the zeitgeist, so quite often, even though it's tangential, there is some way that you can relate that to the current situation and take something away that's useful to you.
I agree, yeah.
Or changes your perspective.
Right.
Broadens your perspective. Might be more important than just changing it.
I would agree. I mean, just to say for this podcast, it's important to me to ask that question, even if I'm talking to a historian of a period 1,500 years ago, for example.
Why do we study history at all?
Right.
And write about it?
Right.
Yeah.
And even if that historian is talking about that period, and I know I don't want to make connections to the present, there still are connections to the present. I don't know if I'd want to talk to a historian that isn't willing to go there, isn't willing to make those connections, just because they're interesting. But it's interesting because if you dig enough, everything is connected to what we're doing right now, which really is a code for what literature is for me.
Yeah, absolutely, because you can read something that was written 200 years ago, and there are still elements that absolutely ring true, and you think, yes, that's just the way it happens now.
Right.
And seeing that connection to the past, I think, situates us in time and as part of the human race and the human story.
Are you noticing, because we're talking about how literature and writing has evolved over time, in the 10 years of this festival, I guess it's coming into its 12th year now. The 12th festival will be in 2020, in the fall. Are you watching an evolution of writing even over that short period? How writing, not just the style or the mood or the trends are changing, but the substance of it, the soul of it is changing.
Definitely the focus of what it is that's concerning writers. As I said, there's quite often a thread. When I start seeing books for the next year's festival, all of a sudden I'm getting this through line of inquiry.
Right.
And that has changed over time. But it is interesting to me how writers, maybe less intuitive writers, are responding to current concerns like the Me Too movement, for instance, or inclusivity of other, like people who are identify differently or who are have physical limitations or that kind of thing. Suddenly, they're piling it on in a book. So there'll be a gay single mom whose child is autistic and whose mother was abused by her father,
Right.
So it becomes a little clunky almost. But then at the same time, there has been a development, and I think as our awareness of the short time frame we have to fix things, really, really big things, the writing is showing that totally.
A sense of urgency.
Yeah.
That was one of my questions, is what preoccupation are we seeing through the lens of literature today, or just writing, or even journalism, that tells us about what on earth is going on? And urgency is something that would come to mind for me, for sure. Mm-hmm. And this sense that we're heading towards a cliff, the edge of a cliff, and we're not slowing down as we go towards it. We don't exactly know how steep that cliff is or how far down it goes.
But we can extrapolate from what's happening right now. It's going to be bad.
Right. We have a pretty good idea that even a 1 or 2 degree change in temperature globally will have massive impacts on our civilization, because we're not built on that.
Yeah.
And we're built on a certain stability that has been with our species for a long, long time. But there's been ups and downs, but this is something totally different. Do you sense that there's urgency in literature and writing, even if it doesn't address climate change head on? But there's this sense of...
Yeah. I think many books that are not ostensibly about climate change and climate anxiety are reflecting, and also a growing recognition of humanity's impact on the natural world, and a regret for that, and a desire to improve that or slow down the devastation.
And is there, and I think you've said so already, but the place for books and writing and literature to change that is a solid one.
Yeah, because awareness can come. It doesn't have to be just laid out in this logical format of A, then thus B, and, if B, then C. In a creative way, a writer can lead you.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me, a writer can make me feel the anxiety for the present moment, and therefore feel like them, God, I've got to do something, even as an individual, even as someone who's consuming news. But the problem that I often feel is I'm well aware of the anxiety and the urgency in the world. In fact, there's almost too much of it. And this is the question of knowledge and education, right? We think that the first step is to let people know that there's a problem. So if we didn't know that asbestos was a problem, well, the first step would be to tell people, okay, guys, let you know asbestos is bad. You shouldn't be breathing this in. We should be taking it out of our homes. Absolutely true. But climate change and not just that, but also the growing economic inequality of our society, the increasing political polarization and instability. These are very intangible problems. They're very difficult to tackle head on. Even if all of the countries in the world got together to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, how exactly do you do that?
Right.
It's almost impossible for an individual.
There's so much. It's difficult for we ordinary folk to make the connection, to see the real connection between the sources of greenhouse gases and the environmental effects that we are experiencing.
Right.
So how do we make that connection in a way that means something to us?
But also, what if we've all made the connection?
I'm going to stop eating beef.
Right.
That's going to fix everything. Or it's not going to fix anything, so damn it, I'm not going to stop eating beef.
Right. It's the old, the tragedy of the commons, which is an old idea in public policy and philosophy, that if I take the right action, nothing will change. We all have to take the right action. But if all of us take the right action, then there's an incentive for one of us to not take that action and gain the benefit. For example, if only one of us gets to eat beef, well, what a paradise. They got all the beef in the world and the rest of us are foregoing it. But if there's that incentive for one, there's an incentive for all, and it becomes it's the prisoner's dilemma as well.
Well, and the thing is, you can act as an example. And you look at Greta Thunberg, she's acted as an example. She was a single person doing what she felt she needed to do in order to express her own anxiety about what was happening. She thought, what can I do? And she has said that she felt a lot of anxiety and depression around the climate problems, and it was by taking a single action of deciding I'm going to skip school, I'm going to sit in front of the legislature with my sign saying I'm on strike for the climate. And now she's started a global movement. So, eating beef, not eating beef, maybe not a good choice, but every choice we make actually does have an impact, whether there are other people doing it or not. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you may choose to stop using Amazon. We're so addicted to that convenience, but I was thinking about it today. You hear stories now about people working in the warehouses at Amazon who feel they cannot take a bathroom break because their supervisor is going to come. What's right? If I'm tempted to use Amazon, I want to think about those people.
Right.
Say, for my convenience of having this item tomorrow, how important is this item to me? But I won't shop at Amazon.
And I'm totally with you, and I do think that individual actions make a big difference. But to play devil's advocate for a second, part of the pessimism of our age and the urgency of our age is that it's this feeling that it doesn't matter,
Yeah,
whether
yeah.
or not that's true.
Yeah, and then you just shut down and say,
Right.
well, nothing I can do.
Exactly.
Really.
So
Yeah.
I remember in the 90s when it was discovered that Nike shoes and all other kinds of shoes were made in sweatshops, and that it was abhorrent. If you knew that this was made in a sweatshop, that you should never buy this stuff, how dare you buy something that is essentially working off of slave child labor? There's really no question that that's what it was, and that's what it still is in many countries like Bangladesh, even parts of China, Myanmar. And yet nothing changed. There was this massive paradigm shift in the Western world. All of a sudden, we all associate Nike with sweatshops, and Nike is doing better than ever, whether it's 20, 30 years later.
Because there are, for every person like you or me that understands that correlation between Nike products and what's happening to their workers, there are one or two or three other people who are completely unaware. And it does, it's the kind of person who is going along unplugged. I just live my life. This is the way I've always done it. They're not engaging critically.
Or is it
the world around them.
Is the case today in 2019 that they're too plugged in? There's too much. In other words, I'm so
there
plugged
might be
in
some of that.
I just don't know what to pay attention to anymore.
So forget it. I'll get what I want. Yeah. I mean, I think what comes in is some kind of moral sense too.
Right.
Somewhere in there, the people who are making choices have a moral drive too. Not just an understanding that selfishly this is going to affect me. Okay, let's go back to eating beef. You're looking at the moral aspects of raising animals that way,
right.
Of et cetera, right? And so the people who are overwhelmed to the point where I know it's all happening, but there's nothing I can do, are the people who aren't thinking deeply about what's right.
It seems that a common thread in literature today is urgency, and that's something that Barbara has mentioned several times in this episode, and it seems to come up as she reads books preparing for future festivals. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about the theater, Barbara's background in the theater, and why when something goes wrong in the theater, it may not actually be such a bad thing. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. But we are faced with something that is so inherently human that we are unable to make the right choice, even though we know what the right choice may be.
You have to teach your children this. This is what you have to teach your children, is right and wrong. And how to make a moral judgment, how to use their intellect to piece together the right course of action. And we know that it's not always clear that there's only one course of action, too, because there can be... it can be sort of a series of Sophie's choices,
Sure.
Dilemma where if I go this way, then there's this bad outcome. If I go that way, there's that bad outcome.
Right.
So it isn't easy.
Well, and to me, it seems like this is where art and literature comes in perfectly, because almost any good story that I can think of deals with a dilemma where there is no real good choice, or I don't know what's on the other side of this.
Yeah.
If it is clear, it's not a good story. If it's clear and present, and the character knows what they should do, and I know what they should do, it's more like a fairy tale.
Yeah, or it's didactic,
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas a good story is about the dilemma that we seem to be facing on a global, urgent scale today. Mm-hmm. And to me, I don't know how, but that seems to address the question for me: why should I be reading books in an age of crisis? Mm-hmm. Why should I be engaging with a story in an age of crisis? Because in a way, it's maybe making me more elastic in my moral ability to navigate this complicated world.
Yeah. One of my favorite writers is Dorothy Dunnett. She was a Scottish woman, very well educated, and she wrote historical fiction. And her most famous series is the Lymond series. And so she has a central character who is, so this takes place in the 15th century. And he's a nobleman, but he has got caught up in has been accused of being part of a plot to kill Queen Elizabeth of England. And he gets sent to the galleys, and then he's persona non grata in Scotland. And he spends all of, I think it's 7 books, They're all based on chess, which is very cool. But he's ambiguous because so often he does things you want to believe in his goodness, but he uses all kinds of very devious and unscrupulous ways and uses people and manipulates things, all with the drive to try to exonerate himself. And he's just such a fascinating character. What is going to redeem him? You just wonder, is he ever going to be redeemed? You never know what he's going to do next. He has this cadre of followers, some of whom believe absolutely in his goodness as a person. He's just been through a lot. He's misguided. Then there are followers who cycle through. Yeah, he's the man too. Like, he is repugnant to me, what he's just done.
Right.
It is so fascinating.
That is fascinating. I love that. I love when a book or a film or a television show does that to me. It's almost like it's tricking me. Hey, you don't think you like this person? I'm going to make you like them.
Yes. Yeah. And then it'll be like you're all on board with this person who is against that person, and then you get that person's side starting. Wait a minute.
Yeah. Right. That's what was really, for me as a kid, was really influential, was reading the books of George R.R. Martin, which later became the huge TV series Game of Thrones. And I think the TV series does a lot what the books do. But the books start you much more innocently, where you think you're into a world of good and evil. You think that, okay, the Starks are good and the Lannisters are bad.
Right.
And it's simple. But
black and white.
Right. And that starts to degrade. And I think because... And I may be wrong about this, but it seems like George R.R. Martin, when he started writing those, started with that premise and then later sort of corrected it, or at least broadened the perspective. Yeah. Because it was a surprise in the later books when you started to get behind the eyes and the brains of the characters you had thought were just the bad guys. And that doesn't happen in the first book, from what I can remember. There's a little bit of that because you shift characters. But that was very important to me growing up, to understand, try to see it from the other side and from the other person's perspective, even if you're only trying to win in the game of chess. Because you bringing that up is really cool, because for me, I'm not an expert chess player, but if you want to be good at chess, you have to be able to put yourself into the mind of the other person, not just thinking about what move should I make next. No,
that's right.
What will they do next?
Trying to predict. And interestingly, because this is set in the Renaissance, done it. I mean, she does fabulous research, or did. She's not with us anymore, but she encompasses the political structure of Europe, and the religious houses, and the battles that were taking place, the power struggles and the plots and all of that kind of thing, but also the arts and what was happening in terms of in technological development, because it was right on the cusp, sort of like, of the development of machinery and machines of war and bigger guns, like cannons and this and that. And she really puts you right into that scenario, and nothing is black and white. Right. And you don't know who your friends and enemies are. Yeah. Especially if you're moving at in high circles where Lyman moves. He moves through royal courts, and he goes all over Europe. Each book takes place in a different place.
Reading those books, did that change your perspective did it move your position, change your perspective of the world?
Yeah, and I've reread the series numerous times, and each time I'm actually more moved by the moral dilemmas that he as a character faces. They're heartbreaking. And I just bawl at to think of anybody having to make a decision that he has to make. Yeah. But he has a lot of fun doing it too. So that's the other great thing about this book, is it's full of humor. It's extremely she just brings in all kinds of like poetry and songs in other languages, and you're constantly on your toes trying to understand and also because he's such a mercurial character, there are these plot twists and rollicking good times and climbing over the rooftops and getting zany ideas with his buddies, and she keeps you reading. It's like a mystery, romance, historical novel comedy, tragedy. It's got it all.
And the thing that strikes me more than anything when you talk about this is a sense of fun.
Oh, yeah.
That it's just fun. You don't know where it's going to go next. And fun in the way that playing a board game can be fun.
Yes.
Or fun in the way that watching a television show can be fun. Like, what's going to happen next?
Oh,
and it's
absolutely.
almost like a guilty pleasure, but at the same time, it's confronting you with deep issues and moral dilemmas. And again, this ability to reposition your understanding of the world in order to navigate it. Which leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, because it's a big one when we talk about literature today, which is what is the future of literature? There's been many articles written over decades now, ever since radio came along, let alone television, the rise of social media, cell phones, that the book is dead, the novel is dead, literature is dying, all of this stuff. I don't buy it, and that's not my question. My question is not, is the novel dying? No, but my question is are we transforming literature as a result of the pressures, these intense pressures that are on it? And are we finding other ways to tell a story that aren't necessarily rendering it obsolete or even competing with it, but are forcing it to address them in the way that Impressionist painting in the 19th century had to address photography?
Yeah.
And respond to a world in which we could take a realistic photograph. So what's the point of painting it anymore? I'm talking about not just television, which is old now, but also games, video games, which are so immersive, whether through VR or AR, but also tell stories with huge musical scores, and they take years to develop. I'm talking about huge plot lines and moral dilemmas that are baked into them too. How does literature, writing in this more traditional way, respond to this cornucopia of ways of telling story?
It seems to me that it happily coexist side by side. I think that story picture, story, other kinds of media, I think they can't speak to each other, but I don't see that necessarily that literature is required to compensate or respond to these other art forms.
How do they speak to each other?
Well, I think storytelling is storytelling. So it could be movies or graphic novels, traditional novels, video games, role-playing games. I guess there's a slightly more dynamic quality to role-playing games, especially if they're kind of the online variety where you're working with people on a team or as adversaries or whatever, and you're developing your own character.
Right.
But then there's like fan fiction. I think that might be a response. Is it literature? I don't know, but it's a response to literature that's dynamic and that takes characters and storylines in a direction that maybe the original author would never have considered.
There's another aspect here, too, which is that the role of the creator, the role of the artist behind the thing. We think of the writer in this romantic way, going off into a cabin, whatever it is, but working by themselves. It's a very, not necessarily lonely act, but solitary act. And creating a world unto themselves and trying to communicate that world to us through a book. But a film, for example, is often written like by a committee.
Yeah.
A video game is created by hundreds of people, which may have a leader, but that leader can't, there's no way that leader could have written all the lines of dialogue, all of the different choices that happen in the game. You have, I think they're called narrative designers. So you have like a graphic designer, but you have a narrative designer, and their role is to write the dialogue, to write the different scenes that might happen and all the different choose your own adventures that occur in a video game. But even though you still can tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with all of the same features of a novel, the idea of this solitary artist is completely transformed. And I wonder if there's room in the literary art to do that. And maybe it's just a simple question: can two writers write the same book? Which obviously the answer is yes. It's happened before. But is this a response that could happen, or do you think that it's been done already and it's probably going to continue the way that it already has?
I don't think of writers as being egotistical and not wanting to, share their great idea or collaborate in any way. I think if the writing process could work that way, then, certain writers would be interested in doing it. But
And I know that there are examples of this, and I don't necessarily know where my question leads, but I ask it because I wonder if one of the transformations that we're living right in the midst of is a transformation into what the individual is and what role we have, not just as a writer, but in our society.
Mm-hmm. I think the more important question really is what happens when that book is written? And that's where the real collaboration comes. And
Right.
you see it at our festival, for instance, when you put two writers on a stage or a writer with someone who's going to interview them, that's where it really comes to life. And I know the writers value that moment a lot. Because it is, they collaborate in the sense that they work very closely. If they're published with a traditional publishing house, they would work very closely with an editor, and that is extremely collaborative. And even the copy editor or the person who does the final sort of proofread has there can be a lot of back and forth.
Yeah.
And the story can change for the better. And most people, if you read acknowledgements, I always read the acknowledgements that a writer includes in the book. 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, they thank their editor and specifically say that this story wouldn't be what it is without that person's eye.
I love this idea of collaboration, which can occur in an event like at Kingston WritersFest.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, I guess the answer would be yes, but I guess my question then is, why is it that when I sit in an event about a book I've already read with an author that I may know through YouTube videos or podcasts or whatever, but at the end of the event, just by sitting in the room, my perspective of that book has changed. The story, in a way, has changed for me. And I think we both agree that happens, with that interesting alchemy that happens in the room. But
Absolutely.
Why is that? Like, what is it about? Is it, and maybe the answer here is a theatrical one, is the sense of us being in a room together.
I've always believed in the importance for live, sort of performance events like that kind of thing that we do, that there's a circular energy. And if you've done theater, as have I, you know that there is an energy that comes first from the actor or the writer who has created this thing that everyone's examining together. And that energy goes out as they speak about it, and they project that out towards the audience, and the audience gets something and responds, and there's a visceral response. And then there's a physical energy that comes from the audience and goes back up onto the stage to the actor or the writer. And that is the magic of festivals, for sure.
And it's that interesting, that tennis ball going back and forth.
It's
because
circular.
That circular energy isn't just one loop. It's thousands, millions, an infinite loop and we don't know where it's going to go.
That's right. And it can continue to loop as people leave. As you probably saw at this year's festival, people going out and going, oh my gosh, and talking in the lineups and in the elevator, and at the end saying, my mind is blown, so many new ideas. And of course you go, well, you don't turn that off, you're still thinking about it. Right.
It's like what's often said about the theater is that when the curtain comes down, that should be the beginning of the play. That's really where the energy of the play begins. Everything else up to that point hopefully was a prelude, and if it's not, then the play has failed. Even if I've laughed for 2 hours and had a great time and was entertained, if I'm not moved, then my experience is limited to that box of time. But if I am moved and I am changed and my perspective does change, then my $20 for a ticket buys me a lifetime of experience and understanding and development.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was talking about, broadening your perspective, because quite often a good play and a good book will leave you with new questions, things you had never thought about before. And so that is material that you use for your own development.
Is it a surprise for people to learn that your background in the theater dovetails so clearly with your work now as artistic director of the Writers Fest?
That's how, I don't know if it surprises people or not, but that's how I got involved in the festival in the first place. Funny how these things happen. I worked for Chapters, and I was here in Kingston, and I had, this is years ago now, I was approached by one of the producers at our Cogeco TV station, and he had an idea to do a live to tape book club, and he wanted to team up with Chapters to do this, and he thought maybe there'd be somebody on staff looking at me, knowing I did theater, and he'd seen me in plays that might be interested in hosting it, and, hands up. So that's what we did, and I hosted a TV book club for Cogeco for 2 years and curated
It was called
Page Turners.
Page Turners. I have it written here. I can't read my own writing. Yeah.
And so that was great fun. So there's obviously a performance aspect to that, and that's how I initially started meeting with writers, because I would invite 1 or 2 writers to read 2 books that I would have selected, and I would read them, and then we'd gather in the studio and we'd have a little book club about them, and it also gave them an opportunity to promote something new that maybe they had just published. And so, Kingston is rife with published writers of some stature, and so I was having them on the show. And at one point I had the person who was thinking of continuing this very nascent little festival that had been run by 4 or 5 volunteers. And she asked me if I'd be interested in sitting in a meeting to talk about the possibility of maybe professionalizing this thing into an actual annual book festival. I said, sure. So that's how I got started with that. And,
wow.
We had our first meeting in March, and by September we had a festival, and it went very well. It was
this
extremely
was 2009.
successful. Yeah. And because I had a background in theater, I was the production manager, because I knew how to get people on and off stage on time.
Right. Yeah.
We were doing an event at the Grand Theater, and she said, do we really need to have like a script? Or I said, we do. We need to have something that says, curtains up, lights up, so that the people in the booth know what they're doing and the people on stage know what they're doing. Oh, okay. And then afterwards she's like, oh, that was a really good idea.
Well, and that's an ongoing, I don't know if we'd call it a theme, but just a thing that is about Kingston WritersFest, that it is so well organized, that it's timed out, it's planned out well, so that an audience member can feel comfortable, which is a theme for me in my theater background, was just do all the small things for them so they don't have to worry about it, so they can focus on what you want them to focus on.
Absolutely. And if the wheels, if there's a hitch, by your own demeanor, you will either transmit to the audience that they should be uncomfortable, of like, ooh, what just happened, or nothing.
Right.
And so that's what we aim for, is whatever's happening behind the scenes, nobody out in the house knows about.
Right, right. And sometimes, and this is, we're kind of going to theater nerddom here, but sometimes that can be a so-called gift from the gods. When something bad happens, there's an opportunity to transform that into a live, wonderful moment where we react and all feel we are present together. The script has had to change, but we're writing it together collectively.
And it's, we've been presented with a problem and we're collectively solving it and getting ourselves out of the fire.
And how fun is that?
That's so fun.
That's like playing a game together.
It's the best, really. When things go sideways on stage, it's the best, because it is that moment for, okay, you got it, and you're not going to stop and, look at your tech person off stage and go, help.
Right.
No, there's none of that.
And in a way, that's the one thing we're trying to avoid happen.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when it happens, if we can embrace it.
And not let on.
Then not let on. Or just say, everyone saw that, so let's use that.
Right.
Then it becomes next level. Even if, and this is something I've noticed on stage a lot, is that even if the audience hasn't noticed it, the energy that it gives the actors who do notice it is unparalleled, because they really are alive now, and they really are responding to the moment, rather than following the script that they've been learning for weeks, months, whatever it is.
Yeah, and slipping into that comfort zone of, okay, this is where I move here. And
right.
I cross there now. And
and that liveness is something so interesting to capture.
Mm-hmm. It's the best.
How do you get that lightning in a bottle?
Yeah.
Even at WritersFest, how do you try to, without planning mistakes, how do you try to capture lightning in a bottle like that?
I think at the festival, where it comes from is in putting the right people on stage together.
Okay.
For instance, this year we did an event on sort of women's different approaches, sort of non-traditional approaches to spirituality, and there were 2 great books that were available, Skeptics and Seekers and Book Must Book, which I'll remember later. These people hadn't met before, but clearly their books had so much to say to each other that the conversation just took off. And it was like, for the audience, was like being a fly on a wall, watching three very smart women on stage having a really fabulous and fun conversation. There was lots of laughter. It was spontaneous. And people came out and said, wow, I didn't expect that. Yeah. I didn't know about either of those books. Oh, My Year of Living Spiritually, I believe it is. And she tried everything from, oh my gosh, like Dia de los Muertes, and I can't even remember all the sort of very peculiar spiritual practices, tree bathing.
That she tried out.
That she tried out in a year, to write this book. Pretty fabulous. But that's the magic. That's the lightning in a bottle. And everybody who was at that event will always remember it.
Yeah. It's so cool to think that the decision to do that happened months and months before, thinking just the alchemy of how do I bring people together to create the magic that we can see on stage, which I think can separate a writers' festival from, okay, let's just get people who write books to come into a room, which becomes a sort of a celebrity worshipping event, as opposed to, I can't wait to see my favorite writer, as opposed to, let's see magic unfold between people who have something to say on a certain subject, and not know where they're going to go.
Yes. I always have hope. So when I program something like that, I go a lot, I think I would say, on instinct when it comes to actually putting the events together. And I have hope about what this conversation will be, and I'm always very happy when that's what happens, or better. I mean, it's always going to be even better, but I'm like, that's exactly what I was hoping would happen with this few people on stage.
This is something that you and I both have a shared experience with, which is how to title these different events. And the reason I ask this is because I was mentioning before we started recording that for these podcasts, I don't create the title until after the conversation has been had. I'm lucky that way. I get to see what we've talked about and then add the title. You can't do that with Kingston Writers Fest because you've got to advertise these events, come up with a catchy title, which the speakers may or may not stick to. But one thing that's so fascinating is that sometimes they feel they have to live up to the title or the description in the program guide. So how do you navigate this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky kind of a skill. You want to make a nod to the content of the books and where you see the connections being. So it is a sort of direction to the interviewer or moderator to say, this is the trajectory that we see happening in this conversation. And that it may not be where it goes, but it can't be so sort of indicative that it doesn't offer any mystery to the person who might be considering going to the event. So there has to be a bit of a question mark in it too.
Yeah.
Where they're like, that's intriguing.
Yeah.
That's what, a really good event title will do, is say, that sounds cool.
Yeah. I wonder where that will go rather than, I hope this will deliver on what it's promised me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last question for you, and it's a question I haven't asked for a while in the podcast, but I used to do it all the time at the end, which is, if there was one thing that we haven't talked about that you wish we had, and if we had another hour that we could, what would that one thing be?
Favorite books from childhood up.
Well, we can do that.
That'd be a week long.
Well, let's try to do it briefly. What are your? Let's go for five favorite books.
I loved British writers, so I would say The Borrowers. I loved the whole Narnia series. Read it long before the movies. Loved The Lord of the Rings. Wow. Now you've put me on the spot because I thought about it, but I didn't think about it. Okay, you go with 3.
Oh, I have to do it too?
Yeah.
But okay, all right. So I think we probably both have the same preface, which is, okay, my 3 are the first 3 that are coming to me. There are probably 23 others that are maybe more deserving of the top spot. But Kafka, actually, reading Franz Kafka's books. So
as
the
a child?
No, sorry. Oh, it's only as a child? Only in that?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you meant like from childhood on. Okay,
Well,
okay,
I
okay.
did,
okay,
but that
okay.
would take a week. So
Okay,
I
so-
started in my youth.
Right. So then I would have to say, because I mentioned it already, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire had a big impact on me. There was a book, this is going to sound silly, but I was reading it around when I was 12 or so, and it was a book about, called The History of Europe. I have no idea who wrote it. I've tried to find it, haven't been able to find it since. It's not Norman Davies' A History of Europe. I read that later. But it was a very dry history of everything that happened in Europe from time immemorial to today. And I loved it. I loved it because it was food for my imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I loved about reading it. And it was a page turner for me. And it was just really encyclopedic capturing of one fact after another, after another, after another. And I know that sounds silly, but it just changed my perspective of the world piece by piece by piece by piece, and kind of gave me a foundation on which to understand, well, what on earth is going on? Why are we here?
Mm-hmm.
How did things get to be here? And that book was page after page of telling me, this is how. This is what led to this. This is what led to this. You could do the same, I'm sure, with a history of China, history of Africa, whatever. But that was a teaching moment for me, and a very long explanation for one of my favorite books. So back to you.
Oh, Lord.
Did you think of any other?
I loved Harry the Dirty Dog.
Harry the Dirty Dog.
Yeah.
What is that?
Just what it sounds like. It was an absolutely sweet picture book, and it featured a little, I'm going to say it was sort of a terrier-type dog, a little white terrier-type dog, and he lives in New York City, and he gets away accidentally and has adventures, and ends up in a funny kind of half-knit rose patterned knit sweater, but he's also been through a big mud puddle. So by the time he comes home, he's black and really not recognizable. But it does have a happy ending. You know, he finds his way back to his real people.
Cool.
Yeah.
I had one other. It was Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Yeah, and like classic kids book. But for me, it was like, wow, the energy and the movement of that book. And obviously for a boy to imagine another boy being in a world like that, where the whole world is resting on your shoulders because you are a boy, because you are young, was an interesting sort of twist on what you normally read about, or what stories are normally told about. Yeah, that was one.
Enid Blyton's adventure series. So this was interesting. She wrote several different series, and they're kind of formulaic, but I really enjoyed them because I loved all things British. So I loved that they called their running shoes plimsolls, and they're constantly pulling squares of chocolate out of their pockets or oranges, and they happen to have tinned peaches and sardines, you know, in their rucksack, and they can make a little lunch when they're in the castle of adventure. But so it's 4 children, you know, they're maybe in the 10 to 12 age bracket, but they have agency. So mom just kind of lets them go off and do whatever they're going to do. So that's why they pack their little rucksacks. They go up the mountain of adventure and get into all kinds of trouble, but they come through it, and they're great problem solvers, and they have great courage. And one of them has got a cockatoo named Kiki, who is, and they're great mimics, birds are, you know. So Kiki has this whole repertoire of crazy things that come in handy sometimes, but fooling the bad guys. So she'll say, you know, shut the door and wipe your feet, blow your nose, and they'll be looking around saying, where did that come from? Who said that? And get all freaked out. So it was a world just so completely different from the life I was living, and these children had such freedom, which was really cool to me.
Yeah.
I had freedom in a sense, or certainly more freedom than children nowadays have.
Well, and it sounds like not just freedom, but self-sufficiency, or a certain reliance on yourself to get by.
And this courage, you know, when they're put in these situations of danger and, you know, come out smelling like roses, like Harry did.
Right. Barbara, I'm going to end it there because we could go on for hours probably on this one.
I think
so.
But
thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
Oh, it has been such a pleasure, and I'll talk to you anytime.
To learn more about Barbara Bell, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as a way to get in touch with me by social media or by email. Finally, and if you can, please go to Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use, or you can do the same thing on Facebook and give this show a rating and a review. It helps immensely. Your quote of the week is from one of the authors that we mentioned in this episode, George R.R. Martin, the author of the Song of Ice and Fire series, which was the basis for the television show Game of Thrones. In one of the books, Martin says, "A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one." Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks to the Kingston Writers Festival for giving us the space in which to record. As usual, stay in touch and let me know what on earth you think is going on.